Welcome to Talking with Authors tonight. I am deeply intimidated and also really excited because we have three authors tonight who are going to talk us through the true horror story that is AUKUS. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Gadigal country. It's the land of the Eora people. It is country that was never ceded. I'm on stolen land. And we wait to live in right relationship with this country when we have reconciled, when we have made treaty, when we have had a chance to actually be truly welcome to country as brothers and sisters rather than as colonisers. I'm really grateful for the beautiful care and nurturing First Nations people gave this beautiful old country. Having said that, the book we're talking about tonight, the authors we're talking to, are all about, it's all on AUKUS. And as I was reading it, it really struck me that it makes a lot of literal sense and it makes a lot of metaphoric sense that what we're talking about here is largely submarines. Submarines that we can see a tiny little periscope at the top. But most of the beast is under the water and most of the beast is unknowable, literally, metaphorically, politically, and economically. So I'm really grateful to Mark Beeson, Sian Troath, and Kanishka Jayasuriya for editing this book. You're not the only authors, but because you're here, you are the most important authors of this book. I'm also really aware that there's a lot of people here, and I really promise, I always do this and then it turns out to be a bit of a lie, but tonight I really promise to try and make sure we've got 10, 15 minutes left towards the end to get feedback and questions from everyone else. And for everyone who is listening and watching, can you put into the chat any questions you would like asked or particular issues raised? And I will really do my best to get through to them before the end. So let me introduce our hosts, and I'll introduce all three together so then we can just get down to the book. Mark Beeson is an adjunct professor at the University of Technology, Sydney and Griffith University, previously Professor of International Politics at the University of Western Australia. And before joining University of Western Australia, he taught at Murdoch, Griffith, Queensland, York University in the UK, and Birmingham, where he was also head of department. Kanishka Jayasuriya is Professor of Politics and International Studies at Murdoch University. Sian Troath is Associate Lecturer at the University of Wollongong, having formerly worked as Postdoctoral Fellow at ANU and University of Canterbury, where her research focused on political economy and the politics of expertise, militarism, emerging technologies, Australian defence, foreign policy, and theories of trust in international relations. Sian, you must have been exhausted at the end of that. It's a massive subject. We really want to get through as much as possible. The thing that really shocked me about the book is I thought I knew a bit about AUKUS. I thought I knew a little bit about the background. And in reading the book, I realised I knew next to nothing about it, which is a problem. It's a big problem. So, Kanishka, I'm just wondering if we could start with you, and if you could possibly start with how the book came together, and then investigate some of the your chapter talks really beautifully about the merging of militarisation in Australia and neoliberal ideology.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Sorry, I dropped out a bit. I just turned my mobile hotspot on.
Did you hear us, Kanishka? Was I clear?
No, I didn't hear part of it, but
okay.
I'll assume that you were talking about, me leading off, talking about how the book came about and the reasons for it. And in a sense, Julie, the the broad concerns we had in writing this book and bringing together, the diverse variety of authors, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. So we felt that the debate in Australia was very much skewed towards a very narrow technical debate about AUKUS. And in a sense, deliberately so, because, we have our major political parties, our major media networks, in a sense, all supportive of AUKUS. And part of this was to actually create a bit more public space, public engagement, so that we could have more informed discussion about this issue. The second reason, and I'll touch upon that when I'm talking a bit about that neoliberalism and AUKUS, is kind of to contextualize AUKUS, because one of the things we need to do is that this is not simply about submarines or Australia making submarines or China. Our understanding of this is that it needs to be contextualized in a broader global crisis of the international order and Australia's place in the international order, and a changing US role in that order that we're essentially being asked to sign up to. So in a sense, we think that the significance and the implications of AUKUS go much beyond the submarines. And I think it's some aspects or a dimension of debate that's not been properly understood in general public discussion. And the third reason for the book is, and we have, the editors are very proud of this, is that I think we got a really diverse group of authors, not the usual kind of security think tanks, but people coming in from different perspectives, different backgrounds. So, for example, we have a paper by Professor Wan San on the Chinese community and AUKUS, an issue that rarely gets mentioned. Okay, so that's kind of the broad context around which the book emerged, and basically, as I said, we saw this as a contribution to public debate. So our writing instructions to the authors, not that we always fulfill that, was to write in a simple but academically rigorous language that that could be easily disseminated to a wider audience. So I like to talk a bit about that contextualization, and I think I've probably got another 4 or 5 minutes. Have I, Julie?
You've got until you've answered the questions, I guess. It's your fellow authors who'll kill you.
That could be very dangerous. Look, I'll just basically sum it up in terms of the argument that I want to place and situate some of the chapters as well. In terms of saying that, I think we need to see AUKUS in terms of the broader crisis of global capitalism. And in a sense, one of the things that is distinctive about the book is that this is not just about a military alliance or a set of military arrangements. This is fundamentally about a crisis of that neoliberal capitalist order that was set up in the post-Cold War period that is essentially now fragmenting. And we see. I mean, after we've written this, in the Iran crisis, if anything, this is kind of becoming amplified. And what we've seen, I think, is a kind of the end of that kind of neoliberal globalization, that the US-led management of that international hierarchy, and I emphasize that it was the US management of that international hierarchy that is now in crisis, and essentially the US is now shifting from, if you like, from getting consensus to a kind of more dominating, coercive role in global political economy, both in geopolitics and in economics. And I think AUKUS needs to be seen in the context of that crisis of global capitalism. And we see that in terms of this AUKUS Pillar 2. So, I'd like everyone to have a look at that Pillar 2, which is already being put into practice, which is about security, which is about economics, which is about technology. And one of the arguments, especially Tricia Vijaya, who has a chapter in in the book, but also Sean and myself, is that we are seeing a kind of a neoliberal militarism that is emerging that fuses, if you like, security and economic institutions.
Kanishka, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
Do you see, just before we go on, do you see the Iranian, what is the war against Iran that we're seeing at the moment, the threat to nuke Iran, as a symptom of the crisis, that
Yes.
we move that coercive control?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the things that really I really like to get across, and I think many of the authors in the book like to get across, is the multifaceted dimensions of this crisis, right? I mean, AUKUS is just one symptom of this deeper crisis. The ecological crisis, the capitalist crisis, the low growth rates, the economic stagnation, the kind of inter-imperial competition between the US and China, which is kind of manifesting itself in the crisis of that kind of liberal global order that we come to associate with the 1990s and 2000s. And I think we need to see AUKUS in that context, because it's not just about submarines, it's about reshaping a whole range of things, including, for example, things like critical minerals. So I'll leave it at that and make that point. But I just want to make another, if I can just make another point, that is, I think there's a second crisis here, and that is, in a sense, the political crisis in both the US and in the Australian state. So we see, a lot of AUKUS was driven, for Tony Abbott and Morrison, was driven by populist pressures, right? I mean, for them, in a sense, some of the strategic stuff didn't matter that much. It was about the Anglosphere. It was about sort of reframing, in a quite interesting sense, a kind of a racialized notion of the Indo-Pacific as well. So I think that there's a kind of a deeper domestic political crisis that AUKUS is emerging around. And I think one of the more disappointing things is that how social democracy and centre-left parties like the Labour Party has effectively been incorporated into this militarized neoliberalism. And I'd just like to finally point out, because I think this is really significant in terms of, if you like, the reorganization of the state. Sean's done some brilliant work on how universities, for example, are being subsumed under this AUKUS agenda. But we see this in informal networks, in the kind of the interoperability, as people call it, of the US and Australian forces that mesh together a whole range of institutions that I think are really problematic from a democratic perspective, because a lot of these things are not transparent, not accountable, and fundamentally antithetical, I think, to kind of democratic politics. So I think I'll just leave it there and leave it for others to come in.
Right. Thank you so much. I think that really beautifully sets the scene, because this is so what comes through very loud and clear from the book and from all the contributors is AUKUS is a symptom of something that's gone terribly wrong. And like devastating symptoms everywhere, the causes for the malady are multifaceted. And I think that's really what I loved about the book is it really amplifies the complexity and the multifaceted reach of AUKUS and problem of AUKUS. And on that, Mark, if we could go to you, I really was intrigued by your chapter and a lot of the writing around the emergence of the Anglosphere. Kanishka's just touched on that, but if you could perhaps talk to us about what you've been able to see of how the Anglosphere is actually, it seems to me, a bit of the engine room for AUKUS, actually, because like a lot of people, AUKUS does not make, I think AUKUS doesn't make sense economically, militarily, in terms of international relations, our capacity for nuclear waste, our capacity to run it. It's $400 billion of wasted money. So there is something whack going on. That's a technical term, but I suspect that it's the Anglosphere that is kind of the silent engine of this thing. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. No, there's a long and painful history of Australia's relationship with firstly the United Kingdom and more recently since the Second World War with the United States. And for Australian political and particularly strategic elites, it's just unimaginable that things could be otherwise, that we wouldn't be enthusiastically committing ourselves to being in a long-term strategic with the United States because there's still a fear about Asia or misunderstanding about Asia or concern about Asia, which is mainly focused on China these days. And I think the first point to make about the AUKUS program is that even in the unlikely event that we ever get these submarines, and I think there's a big, big question mark about that, of course, and hopefully we won't. But even if we do, if we get five or six nuclear powered, and of course not nuclear armed submarines, then they won't have the slightest deterrent effect on China at all, if we're still concerned about these kind of deterrence issues in another 20 or 30 years' time, of course. But so China won't be influenced in this by us in any way, if they're not deterred by the United States' overwhelming military superiority and presence, they're not going to be deterred by anything we do. So it's a very expensive gesture about our enduring commitment to the United States and even more bizarrely to Britain. You would have thought Britain by now would have been devalued as a reliable ally. And you would have thought Britain would know better than to be sending gunboats back to the Far East after the experiences of the 19th century. But, we are where we are, as they say. The other remarkable thing about all this, I think, is that Albanese and his government, with only the most minimal consideration, basically a day, they decided to sign off on something that was dreamt up by Scott Morrison. I mean, anything that Scott Morrison was associated with ought to have been given an extremely wide berth because you can just about bet it would be based on self-interest and the fact that Morrison is just one of the great liars and self-promoters that Australia's ever produced. So you would have thought they would have known better, but clearly they didn't because they dreaded being wedged on security. This is the big fear that still drives
Mm.
the Australian Labor Party to this day. And you would think they could eventually discover a bit of spine and, say something about the role that middle powers can play as independent influences of the international system, for example. I mean, I think there's a fat chance of that happening personally. I mean, my particular contribution to this, I tend to start ranting when I talk about AUKUS, and I do stop me if I do, but
Yeah, yeah. I'll
my
just go.
particular my particular contribution to this was to say something about quote unquote opportunity costs. This is a phrase that economists use a lot, and it means basically if you spend money on one thing, you can't spend it on something else. So we've decided to spend $368 billion, which we probably don't have, and which we'll probably never get anything for, on submarines. And we could have spent this money on other things, clearly. For example, it's been estimated that $23 billion would have probably fixed the social housing crisis in Australia. Apparently, $12 billion would have provided free tertiary education for at least 10 years. These, it seems to me, are worthy goals. My particular axe to grind is the problem of climate change. And if you're talking about security threats to this country or indeed any other country in the world, it seems to me, rightly or wrongly, that climate change is the single biggest threat to humanity that we've ever faced in history. Australia is doing more than its fair share to create this problem. We did have, and we still have, an opportunity to do something serious about funding a green transition, about shutting down the coal industry, about doing a range of other things. I mean, some people rather fancifully have suggested that perhaps Australia could do a deal with China when China is actually providing 50% of its own energy from
Mm.
renewable sources now and exporting cheap renewable energy to the rest of the world. Maybe we could suggest to China that we'll shut down our coal industry if they stop building coal-fired power stations in return. I mean, I don't think it's likely to happen, but it's indicative of the fact that it's just unimaginable that ideas that could do something useful for both countries
Yeah.
in terms of their actual CO2 emissions and their role in the international community, if there is such a thing. Sorry, Julie. Sorry, Julie.
So, yeah. No, on the opportunity cost of this, I think a lot of people are increasingly going, like you, doing the maths. How much would a super fast train cost coast to coast? How much would giving every Australian an EV cost? How much, like, it is a really useful exercise to go through, if only to put into kind of imaginable scale the cost of this thing. But that is not the only opportunity cost, is it? Because this is potentially costing us alternate ways of being. And by that I mean, I have a kind of terrifying feeling that we will have Australia before AUKUS and then Australia after AUKUS. That actually the weight of this thing is so gigantic that its transformative powers will really reshape us in terms of our international relations with near neighbours. I'm not sure how Indonesia feels about having a nuclear fleet at her feet. It will transform us in lost opportunities. It will transform us. And, Sian, it would be great to go to you now to talk about the chapter that really did shock me was the chapter you wrote on the impact AUKUS is having on the tertiary sector, and particularly when you start following the money. And, it kind of reminds me of country where a massive flood roars through, and the flood is so powerful, it re-sculpts the country. It erodes the country. And reading your chapter is when I started thinking AUKUS is actually resculpting the tertiary sector even now, before it's even fully underway. So, Sian, I wonder if we could start with that with you.
Yeah, thanks, Annette. Julie, sorry.
That's
Saw
right.
Annette's thumbs up floating through the screen. Yeah, so I think just to contextualize it, Mark and Kanishka brought me into this project because of some work I'd done on the growing closeness between universities, between defence, the government, and between defence industry, and that these had been connections that had been becoming increasingly close, particularly since around 2016. And there were a few different sort of pathways that brought me into this research that made me interested in it. One was, as a PhD student, I did some research on a project with the Defence Security and Technology Group, which was interesting, and also gave me a little bit of an insight into how these relationships were forming at the time. And one of the things that I really clearly remember from that project, because the idea of it was to bring a lot of academics in to do research work for the Defence Science Technology Group, was watching academics sort of change the way that they thought about their research or the way that they framed their research to suit defence interests, because that's where the funding was. And one in particular was a psychologist, and I remember sort of sitting in a meeting with them, and their laptop screen was covered in progressive stickers, but at the same time they said, why can't we just use trust as a weapon against the enemy, unspecified? And that really stuck with me as kind of what changes happen to academics when they intermingle with defence sometimes. And then at the same time, I started a new job as a postdoctoral fellow mapping the lethal autonomous weapons debate. And the first place I decided to start with that was mapping what was actually happening around robotics and autonomous systems and artificial intelligence research in Australia as it related to the military. And it came through really strongly there that it was really being driven, or hopes were being pinned on this growing closeness between industry, academia, and defence as well for military technologies, and particularly for these technologies which are both civilian and military, so dual-use technologies. So you see all of these things sort of coming together over time, and it's because all of these groups have been are seeking different sources of funding, so they're looking to kind of piggyback off each other for funding. And then AUKUS is a really good example of how this plays out, because all of these dynamics were already in place. So universities were getting increasing amounts of funding from defence, looking to build partnerships with defence industry. There's also increasing funding from the US State Department as well, or Department of Defence. And then when AUKUS hits, it becomes really clear, because within about a day of the announcement being made, you start to see universities publicising their interest in AUKUS, because it's quite clear they see it as a source of funding for themselves. So you start to see, particularly in the early days, it's focused on the nuclear-powered submarines on Pillar 1 of AUKUS, and universities are highlighting what they can offer to AUKUS, so particularly skills training, workforce training, that sort of thing. So you start to see universities entering the media, particularly vice chancellors and people in charge of nuclear-related degrees and programs in Australia, to sort of market themselves to government and say, look, we have these skills, please give us money, and we can further your AUKUS streams. And so you see that start to play out from the first day after the announcement. And then over time, it just continues, and universities start adapting degrees, changing the way they market themselves, and making it quite clear that they see AUKUS as a real opportunity for government funding to be able to sort of, access this new line of government funding to be able to fund research in particular.
Joe, do you have any, I'm imagining, that if defence is if I'm working on dual use technology as a PhD student or as whatever, I'm imagining I'm probably also signing a whole lot of confidentiality stuff. I'm probably not free to tell everyone where I'm up to with my research. Like, I'm wondering if you have noted, apart from the diversion, suddenly they go AUKUS and universities go, yeah, that's us. We've got that. I'm wondering if you also have been able to look at the kind of silencing effect this potentially has on our tertiary sector, on, frankly, our public knowledge centres.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that's hard to put into sort of concrete terms, but it's just, I guess, a vibe that you get in the air, if that makes sense. Yeah, you do see, but I think, the biggest effect is really just around, I guess it's almost like the opportunity cost that Mark talked about around prioritization and what actually gets done in universities. Even just to give a sort of a small example, you can think about people with nuclear expertise who would have previously been working particularly around medical applications suddenly being diverted into submarine related applications of that same technology. I think the bigger impact is just around setting the terms of the debate, what research actually gets done, and that sort of thing.
Can you talk a bit about Pillar 2? Because most of us, when we think about AUKUS, we think about big fat nuclear submarines that we're probably not going to get, that are stupid. But actually, Pillar 2 is already being rolled out, isn't it, across Australia? And that's far more subtle, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot more amorphous, I guess. So it's hard to pin down, I guess, exactly what is happening that is under Pillar 2 and what is happening that's just technology cooperation more broadly, because the general goal of Pillar 2 is cooperation on advanced technologies. It's particularly integrating the defence industrial bases of the US, the UK, and Australia. A lot of that is happening, but it does fly under the radar compared to the nuclear powered submarines because they're more obvious, they're a bit more tangible. They're kind of easier to contest, I think, because we can, even though they don't exist, we can see what effects that they're having in a very real way.
Is that a concern about Pillar 2, that it remains a really substantial part of the agreement, and yet it's very hard to put your finger on exactly how that's going to impact us?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I also wonder too, like in a very short period of time, we have seen warfare shift from hulking great big submarines, aircraft carriers and the like, to, $10,000 drones being able to take out huge subjects. And there is talk about, why are we worrying about submarines when China has a massive flotilla of under submarine drones already just sitting there waiting for the day when they are needed. So we're also in a kind of transition phase militarily of shifting from massive kind of weaponry to these much cheaper, low-cost entry points for, any aggressors. How do you think that is working its way through the universities? Like, how much money does that kind of research start absorbing?
In terms of Pillar 2 and new technologies?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly. It would be difficult to trace
Sorry,
out,
these
but
slides. It's hard to say.
yeah. But it's not insignificant. And I think it's also, again, it's sort of the prioritization of military applications over civilian, if that's where the money is for these sorts of technologies, particularly around drones, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, that firstly they end up focused more militarily, but also as tied to the US with sort of the goal of integration and interoperability. The fact that it's both tied to the US and also reliant on the US around software and data infrastructure and that sort of thing.
Do they?
Can I make a point about that,
Yeah,
Julie?
please jump in, Mark.
I was just thinking that it's interesting the point you raised about drones, because they now have these undersea drones. And one of the problems is that it's going to be much easier to find and locate these submarines in the future partly because of undersea drones and just partly because of improvements in technology. So they're going to be much easier to find, much easier to destroy cheaply, and their deterrent effect and their usefulness in protecting the fabled sea lanes. This is one of the other reasons for getting them, according to some of their advocates. That will be highly debatable as well. But you've got to think about what the world will look like in 20 or 30 years' time when they're supposed to be arriving anyway. And it's hard to believe that, A, they won't be redundant and overtaken by technologies that are only on the verge of being developed at the moment. And if we're still obsessed with the need for deterrence against other countries, that implies a level of non-cooperation with our neighbours in particular that is not going to be helpful for solving some of the really challenging problems that we face in the longer term. So sorry to launch into a dark.
No, that's right. But every time we pull back another veil on this thing, the question of why we are doing it becomes louder, and we really have to investigate that story, because we are doing it. It feels like a runaway train. It is the most expensive purchase Australia has ever made in our history. It has more points than a pineapple in terms of, conflict and the like. And yet it continues, which is why I'm kind of curious, Kanishka, if we could go to some of the points you make in the book about where Labor stands on this, because you would think, and certainly Labor branches across Australia have spoken very loudly and clearly that they think AUKUS is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
And yet it goes on like this unstoppable motion machine that we can't stop. So, yes, over to you, Kanishka, to explain this to all of us.
Thanks, Julie. So I see on the chat that there's someone sort of saying, look, I guess we're preaching here to the converted, right? I mean, but the question then is, why isn't there this public engagement? Why isn't there this public debate? And why has it's been so difficult to get that democratic debate going, especially within the Labor Party? So the chapter that I have in the book is on the Labor Party and AUKUS, but I think it also speaks to more generally about the kind of, the term that some people use is de-democratization. The Marxist political theorist Nikos Poulantzis called it authoritarian statism, where we have a kind of a shell of liberal democracy, but increasingly authoritarian tendencies within that. And one of the things we see within the Labor Party is that the Labor Party has become, in what political science would call cartel parties. That is, they've ceased to become mass parties responsive in some fashion or form to their membership. And essentially they have become part of the state apparatus, So the Labour Party sees its role as amplifying or as a conduit for these broader policies that are made in other parts of the security apparatus. And the party, not just the membership, but even the parliamentary party, because I know there's a fair bit of discontent, including ex-members like Doug Cameron, but they've all been shut out of this discussion, as they've been shut out of the discussion on Gaza as well. So I think this raises really interesting questions. I mean, one of the things that the comparison that and I've talked about this briefly, is that we talked about the Vietnam War, right? I mean, so in 1966, Labour had a landslide defeat, where the Vietnam War, but yet in 3-4 years, public opinion had changed, and the Labour Party really didn't shift much in terms of its opposition to Vietnam. And that's not because the party leadership wanted that, because the membership was mobilised, and there were social movements out there where the anti-Vietnam War was a kind of a really pivotal moment in politics. What we don't see, and in a sense, I find that really interesting. The question is, what can we do? Is the absence of those movements. It's the fact that our party systems, especially the Social Democratic Party, where we see these kind of debates unfolding, is effectively not able to kind of conduct those democratic debates. Our media is completely, even compared to the Vietnam War, we just don't see the kind of open analysis and debate that we saw during that period. So it all raises to me these really serious questions about the nature of our polity, the nature of our democratic polity, and the way in which this militarism has been amplified by some of these authoritarian tendencies. And finally, to get back to the question that someone asked, well, what should we do? And I think it's really important that we look outside of these parties, we look outside of the existing structures to build our own movements, And what I like to see is the movements that are able to encompass not just AUKUS, but placing AUKUS in a broader context, talking about AUKUS in terms of climate change, talking about AUKUS in terms of issues of social justice, which are going to be affected by AUKUS. But I think the capacity of these social movements to link those issues and in a sense, to enter the public debate. And that's what I see lacking in Australia at the moment. I mean, even if you go to the UK, you have the Greens now doing really well in the UK, amplifying some of these debates, but it seems to be absent in Australia. And I think it's as much a problem for democratic politics as it is about AUKUS.
Yeah. You'll be very relieved to hear we're about to launch a public inquiry into AUKUS. Next week, we'll be able to,
Oh, good.
admit, announce the commissioners and the call for submissions and the dates for public hearing. And all of that is structured around trying to really punch a hole in the ice, if you like, for these issues to come through. But it's really interesting what you're saying, because, and again, we keep coming back to the idea that in a lot of ways, AUKUS is really just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason that iceberg is there is because we have these other massive shifts underway in terms of, the decline of neoliberalism, the rise of basically warlords, and the dissolution of the international law-based system, all under the threat of not just climate change, but now we've got, a lunatic as well and truly taken over the asylum in the US, and it has taken an axe to all of these things. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because talking to the three of you, reading the book, talking to Al Palazzo and Alan Beam and Ian Lowe previously about all their books. The books are diverse, but there is one issue that runs through all of these, and that is Australia's opinion of itself, Australia's lack of confidence, Australia's anxiety, Australia's feeling of inadequacy, Australia's creepy dependency on the biggest bloke in town. That is also reflected in this book. And, you know, any thoughts on that from all three of you, Sian, Mark, all of you, it would be good to discuss that, because this feels like to shift, to actually change our orientation from the pursuit of AUKUS and the surrendering of our sovereignty that is implicit in Pillar 2. We need to be having a discussion about who we are as a people and what our values are. And stop laughing,
I
Mark.
think one point to make about all this is it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, New Zealand is an example of a country that doesn't spend a lot on defence, and people aren't queuing up to invade it. Its relationship with the United States isn't what it was, but it hasn't made any significant and tangible difference to the way that New Zealand conducts itself or its place in the international scheme of things. I mean, Australian policymakers are always banging on about being an influential middle power with an independent view and ideas to put on the table. I mean, that is complete and utter bullshit the way that they actually go about it, of course, because they never speak up and do anything in particular. But there's some glimmerings of hope. It's finally dawning on the European Union members. It's finally dawning on Canada and various other countries that America cannot be relied upon, cannot be trusted, as you pointed out. Trump is a bit of a liability and unpredictable. So if there's ever a moment to summon up a bit of courage and gumption and think more creatively, differently, particularly when you can join an existing crowd and you won't be isolated on your own and subject to the kind of victimization which Trump might dish out, then this is the time to do it. But, you know, Albo is such a crushing disappointment, and the less said about the opposition, the better. But anyway, sorry to rant.
Is it possible on that? I don't know if any of you have seen any of the information in the contracts for this, but how difficult, just in legal concrete terms, how difficult would it be to get out of the AUKUS project? Sian, Kanishka?
I would have thought.
I think.
Sorry, you go, Kanish.
Go on, Mark. I mean, you know, look, I think it's the question is that Australia's already spent a fair bit of money on AUKUS, you know, sort of, you know, I mean, close to $1 billion that's effectively been given to, as Paul Keating said, you know, supporting industry policy in the US and the UK. So, you know, I mean, there are contracts and but a lot of these agreements are interstate agreements, you know, which you know, presumably, you know, you could, you know, you could opt out of. But I mean, Julie, you said that in a sense, the real game here is AUKUS Pillar 2, which is, you know, and people forget that it's already unfolding. You know, I was, when Sean was talking about the education and military links, and she said, you know, it's really very hard to get information on that. And that's by design. I got to say, that's by design, right? These non-disclosure agreements that universities have, you know, commercial in confidence, is an easy way for them to sort of say, look, actually, I can't tell you about this because it's a commercial arrangement with defense. Or even more, that defense is now, you know, imposes certain obligations on us, including, for example, the kind of vetting by the US of research scientists who work on some of these military agreements, right? So, which to me is a fundamentally, you know, has fundamental implications for academic freedom and academic autonomy. But effectively, you know, the US can, you know, if these agreements have relationships with the US, they can vet the kind of people who work on these on this kind of research. And to me, that's, you know, I mean, that's just a small point, but it speaks to this kind of reorganization of governance that's quite often, you know, very ambiguous, not transparent, and it's difficult to see what is exactly happening. But it is happening within our university sector, and very little information is getting out about some of these arrangements.
Al Palazzo, thank you very much. His comment in the chat is the pain inflicted by the US if Australia leaves AUKUS will not be financial. It would be on the order of what happened to New Zealand when it refused to allow nuclear ships in its port. So there would be a political penalty to pay. We're almost out of time because I do want time to ask questions, but just a brief reflection from all three of you that we are in an extraordinary moment right now. We are in a moment where the President of the United States is threatening all hell break loose. The middle powers are trying to organize and become a coalition at warp speed. We're seeing, genocide in Gaza. We're seeing Lebanon under fire. It is an extraordinary moment. No one knows which way this is going to go. So my question to the three of you, in this moment, do you think it reinforces the community's acceptance of AUKUS, or potentially does it make this a good moment to challenge the US relationship that is embodied in AUKUS? Just briefly before we go to questions. Sian, if I could start with you on that.
I'd say in theory it would make it a good time for the government to challenge AUKUS, but I have to say I am very pessimistic that anything would make them do that because of the disconnect that Kanishka was describing between the party and its voter base. And because of I feel like there was a sort of a peak of public pressure around Gaza, and if that wasn't enough to sort of divert government attention from the US alliance, I can't imagine AUKUS would be enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would take a lot more sustained public pressure and a lot more costs to the Labour government than currently exist. So, yeah, in theory, a good moment, but I'm pessimistic about them taking opportunity of it.
Yeah, which makes me wonder where are the pressure points for Labor. Mark, your thoughts on that?
I think they clearly always have an eye on public opinion and which way the polls are going and those kinds of things. The impact of the current conflict with Iran on oil prices and filling up your SUV and those kinds of things, that might cut through and might have some impact in a way that concern about poor old Iranians getting blown to pieces might not. So that's not to be underestimated, it seems to me. But as Kanish said earlier on, trying to trigger a debate on this, even if it's via the rising cost of living and economic consequences of Trump being a lunatic, even if that's what it takes to make the connections and join the dots, because most people in this country are just unbelievably fortunate. It's the most secure country in the world, no obvious enemies. We don't need these frigging submarines. Sorry, we don't need these submarines, in my humble opinion. But I mean, clearly, it's difficult to get the public as aroused as clearly I am and many other people are. But how you cut through, how you begin to get that debate going and make those connections, it's a difficult and big ask. But I think Kanishka's got the answer.
Oh, thank goodness, Kanish. Thank you so much.
I wish
You're going to save us.
I wish I did. But, look, I agree with my co-editors on everything they've said on this. And I guess, we don't, we don't just give up because it's difficult, because I think this is a really, as you say, Julie, it's a really important, this is this is as important as the kind of interwar period, where you see the rise of the far right, the collapse of kind of international rules and international order. So, this is a really, anyone who's kind of interested in the future of, the future more peaceful, more just global order needs to be active in this space, because this is a really dangerous moment for the world. And, if you don't, as the old adage goes, if you don't organize, you're not going to get anything, So it's going to be a long, hard road. But I do think that, so I agree with Mark. There are things, about people in Europe saying, Trump's the best thing that's happened, for more progressive forces, because, as we saw in Hungary. And clearly the Iran war doesn't have the kind of legitimacy even that that even sort of something like Gaza had. So I do think there are cracks appearing, but we need movements, we need organisation. So I mean, I'm really grateful for people like you, because I think these are the kinds of things that are going to make a difference. It's going to be a long, hard road, but I think that there's no alternative to doing the hard work of organising. And I think organising outside of these main institutions is not going to be sending, petitions to Parliament or whatever. I think we've just got to organise on the streets, be more active, organise in our universities as academics, even though I know it's very hard to do, to demand more accountability from our administrators and from our senior managers when they make these decisions. I've seen brave students, including someone at RMIT. I don't know whether people have seen that. He took a picture of one of the research institutions at RMIT, and RMIT then took academic disciplinary action against him for that social media post. This is, apart from being kind of one of those things that's so silly, but it is symptomatic of the kind of the kind of atmosphere in our universities at RMIT, not just the bureaucracy or the Defence Department, and I think we need to contest those things in those institutional spaces. So, it's going to be a long, hard road, I think, but we have to be on that road.
Yeah. Look, there are a lot of comments. People, I would really ask that you have a look in the chats, because there are petitions to be signed. There are organising tools there, and I totally agree with you that if we don't organise, we will be absolutely organised by people we don't like. Just finally, there was a question previously here about, let's talk about off-ramps. If we were completely brilliant and were able to mobilise a really overwhelming number of the community across electorates, and Labor knew there was a really big threat for them because the Teals, the Greens, the Independents and One Nation had come in behind 400 billion is an insane idea, what would the off-ramp look like? That's my last question, and question from here.
I don't think it would be that difficult. So somebody pointed out that IPAN's already run a ruler over this and said they could just give a year's notice and back out of it, and that would be the end of it. I think the interesting question, I'm sure it would be possible to reverse course. You might not get you a couple of $1 billion back, but you could get out of paying another 368 or whatever it is. But I think you could certainly get out of it. But then the question would be, what are the consequences of that generally? And I just don't think, I think the strategic consequences has been wildly overblown, and I think life would go on as normal, and there just wouldn't be, we wouldn't be invaded by China 2 weeks after we pulled out of the AUKUS agreement. So I just think that's a red herring, and that it could be done, and if there's enough political agitation for it, it really ought to be done. It could be a vote winner.
Imagine that. Sian, any final thoughts on that?
No, I think Mark pretty much covered it. Honestly, I just came from a couple of hours teaching, and I think my brain is done.
Totally fused out. Sorry to hear that.
Sorry.
Kanishka, where are you? Any final thoughts on off-ramps?
I agree with Mark. I mean, I think there's, there are off-ramps, but, there's off-ramps. I mean, it's just not an off-ramp for AUKUS. And I think this is the thing. I mean, it is about thinking about what Australia is going to do, the kind of role that it can play in the global order without this dependence on the US. And I think that's the tougher question, right? I mean, to ask questions about the alliance, ask questions about the relationship with the US. But I think the problem with I think the thing with the US is, of course, that it is now such a revisionist and coercive power that, like the Canadians are finding out, and Canada has a much closer relationship with the US than we do. I mean, if that's possible, through, the defense and borders and so on and so forth, that that there are serious discussions on all sides of the political spectrum in Canada about, what alternative arrangements there are. And I think, it's disappointing to me that we don't have that debate in the we don't have that debate in Australia. There's a debate in the in Europe around these questions. People from all kinds of perspectives. But it is a question that we need to think about. So it's not just the off-ramp for AUKUS. I think it's an off-ramp from the US.
Mm. It's really interesting, isn't it? There are debates going on. We have gotten into, I think, a very bad habit in Australia of looking to political leadership to supply, leadership and solutions. And we should have gotten out of that habit a long time ago. But in the absence, the clear absence of any political leadership, I'm just wondering about the obligation that is on all of us, particularly in the tertiary sector, in the diplomatic corps, where we are having conversations across disciplines, across countries, across states, how much it is on all of us to be making links with Canada, with Europe, with a whole lot of people having this discussion, given that it's not going to be coming from our political leaders.
Julie, if I can just say one thing, I'm reminded of the Cold War period and the kind of peace movement that emerged during that Cold War period, where, the women's peace movement and which is kind of transnational in orientation, right? I mean, and I think we really need to look at that. I mean, obviously the organizational forms and frames are going to be different, tactics are going to be different, but I think we need to look back to some of those movements and some of those organizations. When you talk about those people going up, the march on Pine Gap, for example.
Yeah, all the women, all my mates were up at Pine Gap.
Yeah, so I mean, so the question is, how do we revitalize those kinds of actions, those kinds of organizations, and those kinds of movements?
Yeah. So thank you so much to Mark and Kanishka and Sian. And can I say, this is if you're serious about AUKUS, if you want to know what's going on, it is a really fantastic book. And I hate to tell you, but there's really something for everyone in this book. It's a kind of horror story, but it's an important one to read. As I said, we at APSF, we're the secretariat at the moment for what will be the first public inquiry into AUKUS, and we're pretty excited about that. And people listening, we'll be putting out a call for submission shortly. Please take the time, take the care to do that. And I'm really grateful to everyone who's looked at in the chat. There are links to a number of petitions. Because, the thing is, it is down to us. If we are to prevent this, it is absolutely down to us to build coalitions, to work together, and to be smart about it. I've just started a series of stories remembering good times in activism. And, like we often talk about activism from the peace movement, from the women's movement, from the climate movement. I used to work for Greenpeace. And what we don't talk about is just how much fun it is. It is seriously good fun. It is really scary. It is really exciting. It is putting you on the right side of history, and you develop friendships and have fun. So I just want a big shout out for fun. And remembering that, it is a very serious topic, but when we're all in it together and pulling together, there is joy to be had. There is real joy to be had. So I will finish there. Look at me, 7 o'clock. I am rocking the schedule. Kanishka, Mark, Sian, thank you so much. It has been a fantastic discussion, and we really appreciate your time.